One thing I would like to say before I start is just to give you a bit of indication of sort of maybe the purpose of these talks and sort of where I'm coming from with doing them. So as we've heard, I'm an engagement learning officer here at the archive, so it's my job to know sort of a little bit about a lot. It's my job to sort of show what can be achieved with the collections that we have here, both our documentary, archival collections, our library collections, and the various online resources that we've maybe contributed to or that we use in our day-to-day research. And what that means is, although I've been as sort of thorough and diligent as possible with the research this talk this afternoon, I'm not an expert on this or really frankly anything else, sadly. So it's sort of offered in that spirit. So what that means is when we get to the questions at the end, there'll be time for questions, comments, and even some corrections as well. And that is all welcome. I'm sure with any topic that we talk about here, there tend to be people that come to these with a kind of interest and expertise of their own. And I'm sure that will be especially the case with the topic that we're talking about today. Obviously, the Second World War in general is something that has a particular fascination for many people here. It's often a very big part of either our personal story or our family history as well. So I'm quite mindful of that as we're doing this talk. I do feel a certain amount of responsibility, even both to the things that have happened and to people in the room as well. So we can give some space to that at the end. So with that being said, we will start, and we will turn our clock back 80 years to the 13th of March 1945. What time is it now? Just after 12:30 now. So about 4 hours ago, on the 13th of March 1945, a long-range rocket hit South London in Belvedere. Thankfully, on this particular incident, no one was killed, although four people were injured. The 13th of March is towards the end of the war. The war in Europe ends on the 8th of May 1945, and in Japan later that year. And what we're dealing with then is the final chapter in the air war against London, where two types of what were then novel weapons were used against London, known as the V1 and the V2. The V2 standing for Vergeltungswaffe, which in German is usually translated as the vengeance weapons. And as this suggests, this was almost sometimes described as a final throw of the dice. It was a method of war that perhaps had little strategic value in terms of changing the course of the war, but one that had a great impact on people's lives and was used almost as propaganda in German circles. As we've seen, as I've alluded to, this took place towards the end of the war. And to give you some context of when this campaign took place, the first of these rockets falls on the 13th of June, and our reporting of them ends on the 28th of June. I think you can date that end slightly differently, whether you base it on London or Kent, but our records give this as the time frame for this final campaign. As we heard, they run right through towards the end of the war to really the final weeks of the war. But the start date is significant and important as well. So the 6th of June was the D-Day landings. I'm going to assume most people are sort of vaguely familiar with the kind of the military terminology. It tends to be the case. But just to give a bit of signposting in case anyone isn't, they're new to this topic for whatever reason, the D-Day landings were the start of the Western Allies' counter-offensive invasion of occupied France, and what was meant to be, what was the final campaign against Nazi Germany, as the Western Allies advanced from the west, and the Russians and the Soviet Union advanced from the east. There was much trepidation in the months leading up to D-Day, as you would expect. There was much concern about how the landings would go, but the success of the landings almost lulled the people of London into a false sense of security. The overwhelming superiority of Allied military forces at this time, both in terms of air power and on land and sea as well, meant that they believed that victory was at hand. The war would be nearly over. Sadly, tragically, this wasn't the case. The war runs on for almost another year at this point, and there was much fighting and dying still to be done. And what this means is that the sort of the Vengeance campaign, the V1 and the V2 campaign, has a different feeling for people at London at the time. A profound war weariness had set in by this point. That the hardships of war were harder to bear because they were older, and the war had simply been going on for longer. Their food had been rationed for longer. There was less good food to eat. They were sicker of the food that they were eating already. Rationed clothing meant that they couldn't replace clothes that had been worn out. There was a terrible housing shortage caused by both, the physical damage to London's infrastructure caused by bombing, but by the wear and tear and the shortage of materials to replace it. London was was tired, and this would give this campaign a slightly different character to perhaps the more familiar blitz of the early part of the war. And not only was the kind of the attitude and the context different. Very different types of weapons were used. As we heard, these were novel weapons, and two different types are used. The V1s for the first part were the first to be used, and then later on the V2. And what we'll do is we'll look at the two sort of basically chronologically. So we'll have a look at the early of the campaign, and then we'll introduce the V2s a bit later on as they appeared to the people of London. So what was novel, what was actually seen as particularly sinister and threatening at the time, was the V1s were pilotless aircraft. They were in today's military parlance, we would describe them as cruise missiles or even attack drones. They weren't piloted, and they were, in this case, a sort of rudimentary guidance system based on gyroscope and compass, and a sort of a predetermined amount of fuel. They were launched from mobile sites initially in northern France, and then later launch sites and launch methods were used. The initial missiles could travel around 150 miles. They'd come to a predetermined end before landing on their target. And these missiles are kind of quite characteristic of this phase of the war, both showing kind of an increasing technical sophistication. It's not a technology that was available in the early years of the war, an escalation of the air war as well, where military justification for the targeting of cities and infrastructure was becoming increasingly scant. And also it shows both the technical prowess, but kind of dwindling resources of the German war machine as well. So one of the advantages of these pilotless aircraft is, well, they didn't have pilots, so pilots were in short supply. Fuel was in short supply. In short, they were a cheaper way of conducting the war aims. And the reason they were targeted at London, as we've sort of been alluding to, there has been a growing military superiority from the Western Allies for some years, and one of the ways that has been manifested is from around about 1942 onwards. There's an increasingly heavy and sustained bombing of German occupied cities. The pattern that is settled into is the Royal Air Force bombed by night and the United States Air Force bombed by day. And some target of industry, a lot of targeting of civilians, in the policy known as dehousing. So this was, if you like, as the war reaches its closing years, this was time for the vengeance. This was time for the retaliation. So we have this schematic here, which gives you a bit of a sense of how they work. And in total, around 10,000 of these were launched against the United Kingdom, with the vast majority being targeted at London. This was partly just because of the logistics of doing so, but also because of London's value as a kind of a propaganda target and as the capital. So 10,000 were launched, of which around 3/4 crossed the British coast, and around 4,000 were shot down by defences on the way. Of the 3,500 that weren't shot down, around 2,500 landed in the London area, and 6,184 people were killed, and 17,981 people were injured by the V1s. The campaign started It started with an intensity. The V1 campaign was most severe over the summer months before kind of countermeasures and advances on the continent slowed things down. But as I say, it continues till the 28th of March. And the last of these weapons, of the V1s and the V2s to fall on London, was one of these V1 weapons. And the first of these fell on Grove Road on the 13th of June at 4:25 in the morning. This was part of a raid in which 10 V1s had been launched. Five didn't make it across the Channel, and the rest fell in Kent along the way. With, as I understand, no significant damage being caused. And this is an air raid fire report that's contemporary with that incident. As you can see, the top right-hand corner, dated 13th of June 1944. It gives the time, and it gives various other kind of administrative details and particulars as well. And these records are something that we hold throughout the Second World War, and they're a very important source for understanding what was damaged, when it was damaged, to get a sense of what a different record source calls the particulars of any incident. And you can see here it lists the addresses on the side, the occupiers, the businesses, and interestingly for our purposes, it gives some description, although terse and bureaucratic. It gives us some description of what's happened. It talks about occurrences and supposed causes and general notes. And I've chosen this for a couple of reasons, partly obviously because it's the first raid, it has that significance to it as well. But one point I want to draw your attention to is where it says occurrences, you can see, and supposed cause, it says explosion and sort of crashed plane, crashed rocket. It's actually quite hard to make out. You can see that it's been kind of gone over and erased. What's fascinating in general terms about these documents is that they are working documents. You can see some are printed, some are in pen, different pens, pencil, they've been corrected as they go. These are kind of working documents that give a sense of the immediacy of the calamity facing the capital and the individual people that were kind of doing their best to meet that almost unbearable challenge. And this sense of a working document as well tells us something that we know. We know now this was the first V1 raid. They didn't know that then. They didn't know what caused it. Although there was awareness in sort of high-level military circles that this technology would soon be deployed against London, it wasn't known to the sort of people on the ground. And the initial assumption was that it was a crashed aircraft, a pilot aircraft that had crashed or been shot down. Suspicions that were confirmed by the fact that actually in East London on that same day, a piloted aircraft was shot down and crashed. And in the first few days of the campaign, there is an attempt to keep this information secret, partly for strategic purposes, so as to not give away too much information about what damage is being caused and where, lest that make the operations more effective, should that information get back to Germany, but also purely for propaganda purposes, a concern about spreading panic, a concern about morale. So initially these weren't it wasn't acknowledged what they were, but a few days later, I think people on the 16th of June, we hear that term, we hear them being recognised for what they are, and you will see as these, if you move back and forth through these records, we can see that different terms are used. So here we can see explosion of pilotless controlled aircraft. You'll also see flying bomb a lot, or fly. Various different terms are used throughout. And as I say, you can see this is actually a really nice example of it. You can see how it's being updated and changed as it goes along to give a sense of that immediacy, something real unfolding at the time. Just change it. Just change the slide. So there we go. So the fire raid reports are a very important source if you were interested in doing your own research into history, for your family history, local history, anything like that. And another incredibly important source are the bomb damage maps. I'm often asked in this job, what's my favorite document, and I don't really like to say, because there is a part of me that thinks actually on some of them they're all my favorite. I know that sounds a bit cheesy, but I do feel a real great attachment, possibly an unhealthy attachment, to many of the things that we have in our care here at the London Archives. But if I was really forced, if I was sort of maybe head over heart, and I had to pick a favourite, I would be tempted to pick the bomb damage map. So if you're familiar, if you've come to these talks before, you will have heard me talk about them before. But forgive me if I do say a little bit more about them today. And at least today, I've brought out a slightly different version of them. So the bomb damage maps are a series of around 120 ordnance survey maps that were brought from a survey conducted early in the 20th century and then brought up to date in the years just before the Second World War. And what they do is provide a sort of a street by street, house by house record of the bomb damage sustained by the capital. There are 4 of them on display on the exhibition today, the 4 that cover the central London period. So if you've not seen the exhibition yet, I would recommend having a look at all of it, of course, but have a look at that as well. And if you're joining us from home, the bomb damage maps are readily available online as well. Probably the easiest source, the easiest search that you can do, if you do a Google search, or other search engines are available, if you do a search for the London Picture Archive bomb damage maps, it'll be one of the first hits that comes up, and they're a really important resource. And this image we have on screen now isn't one of those 120 maps, but it's one of the resources that were used to, one of the documents that were used to create the final version of those maps, and it uses the same conventions. So one of the very special things about these maps is they are color coded, and the color indicates the amount of damage sustained on any given occasion. The colors go from light to dark. No colour indicates no damage, and effectively the darker the colour, the more severe the damage. So the purple and black areas on this represent areas of either total destruction in the case of the black, or what was described as severely damaged beyond repair in the case of the purple. And this map is a map that was made shortly after the first flying bomb incident to hit London on the 13th of June 1944. This is Grove Road in Bow, and by pure bad luck, good luck I suppose, depending on your perspective, it strikes a railway. It strikes a railway bridge. So what you can see going through the middle there is a railway bridge, and the blast, as I say, by coincidence, effectively hits that bridge, severing the railway line and killing 6 people in the process. I don't want to dwell on this too much because it's really about as macabre as it gets, but war is a grisly subject. One of the things that was characteristic of the V1s was blast damage. So there's just under 850 kilo warhead at the end of this missile, and this causes a huge explosion, which causes a blast wave, and the damage and the casualties are caused by this. So falling masonry, the physical concussion of being hit by the wave, and huge amounts of injuries by glass and other shrapnel as well. And what this means is that this is actually a different pattern of damage than we see in the Blitz, perhaps the 1940-1941 Blitz. The characteristic sort of danger there was fire. If you think about the near burning of St. Paul's, you think about the famous conflagrations, the burning of the docks on Black Friday. All of those things. The primary threat there was incendiary bombs and fires joining up there. A different nature of damage, a different threat is caused by these weapons. So 6 people were killed on the 13th of June in a raid that saw 10 missiles being launched, one landing successfully. And then we see in June, July, and August the scale of the raids massively increasing as the Germans become more operationally efficient at using these new weapons. And at a peak, we see around 75 and 100 missiles being launched a day. The missiles As we alluded to there, they weren't targeted. They were launched at London, and where they fell was at random. And so we see massively varying casualty figures, from sometimes no one killed to in the sort of to three figures. And one of the earliest and most damaging raids, it was on the 18th of June in obviously 1944 still, and again by bad luck, the Guards' Chapel was hit. So these are the guards of the Household Regiment, the guards that guard Buckingham Palace. Their chapel was near the Wellington Barracks, close to Buckingham Palace. And on 11:20 on Sunday, 18th of June, as the chapel was being used for a service with both soldiers and civilians alike, one of these missiles struck. The explosion collapsed the roof onto the congregation, killing 121 people and injuring another 141 people, both military and civilian. This was, I say, 3 days into the raid, and a immensely, horrendous loss of life, and obviously with kind of an extra dark symbolism, the fact that it happened when people were at a church service, and as you might, unsurprisingly, really, it was used for propaganda purposes as well and recorded. So there is a very quite moving British Pathé film called Frontline London that was released on the 12th of July, so about a month after the start of the campaign, that has sort of live footage, recorded footage, incident footage, that's the word that I'm looking for, of people being rescued from the rubble. It doesn't really work showing footage in this hybrid format. I don't think. It can get a bit clumsy and disruptive. But I'd say for people that are on site, you can watch it in our Mediatek using this Your Past, Our Future educational DVD, but the simplest way might actually be just on YouTube. So if you're at home or you want to look at it when you get home, a simple YouTube on search for British Pathé Frontline London will find this for you. Recommend's probably not quite the right word considering the subject matter, but it's very informative and interesting nonetheless, and it gives a bit more of the context to the raid and other measures as well. So I've said that, I've sort of mentioned this a couple of times, that the raids, the amount of damage caused was somewhat random. They weren't targeted. In a sense, they were targeted. So you'll often read in the various sort of secondary literature that the nominal target of all the V1s was Tower Bridge. Now, I've not been able to trace this claim, this assertion, back to contemporary documentary evidence. The best I could find was in this book, Philip Ziegler's London at War, which is again another really good source and available in our library. They mention that the wit and humorist and MP A.P. Herbert was told this by Churchill. So we can know, at least from that, deduce that Churchill clearly believed this to be the case, and he would of course been privy to the appropriate military intelligence. So Tower Bridge was the nominal target. Of course, it would have been of great kind of propaganda value had that been destroyed. But my understanding is that the choice of that target was more kind of symbolic, as it being in the middle of London and it being actually a very sort of economically important part of London at this time as well, being part of the pool of London, the part of the port of London. Tower Bridge was not hit by a V1, but one came very close, and accounts even say that it went as far as passing through the arches of the bridge before crossing the other side and hitting this tugboat, Nadja, the tugboat. A change of shift was happening on the tugboat at the time, and 6 people were killed. The boat was destroyed and sunk to the bottom of the Thames as well, where it was later salvaged and rescued by other lighters. By this point in the war, British intelligence has totally compromised the German spy network in this country, and what that means is they have a series of double agents, which they can then use to pass false information back to Germany. And there was much debate in the cabinet as to how this could be used to affect the targeting of the missile. Herbert Morrison, Home Secretary and a real sort of champion for London during his political career as well, argued that they mustn't play God, that they mustn't use this information to affect the targeting. But it seems like a compromise agreement was made at that cabinet meeting, and it's And the line that was came up with that they should accept no degree of direct responsibility for the targeting of the bombs. A little bit Weasley perhaps, and something that was open to interpretation. And really, everyone sort of knows that it's hard to confirm that in fact what happened was false information was indeed passed back, saying that the missiles were sort of falling 2 or 3 miles short of the center. Excuse me, 2 or 3 miles past their target, which through the kind of the course correction means that they'll end up falling short, so outside of the center. And what this means, along with the sort of the flight path of the missiles, was in the V1 campaign, South London sustained more damage than the rest of London, and the worst of the South London boroughs affected was Croydon, and it was hit more than any other borough. So the figure you hear is 142 missiles fell on Croydon. There's some variation, of course, depending on how things are accounted for, but have that as sort of a figure to anchor yourself to. And these caused 1,000 houses to be destroyed and 57,000 to be damaged. A real sort of insight into the sort of the day-to-day reality of these bombings can be garnered from this report, which is an in-depth. It's about, I don't know, it's about centimeter thick analysis of one single bombing raid, flying bomb incident, excuse me, on the 28th of July 1944 in Lewisham, as you can see there. It was eventually published after the war, and the idea being it would be a way to kind of learn the lessons from the incident, to assess how it was dealt with. And what we see. And what we see, and this might be quite hard to make out, so we won't go about it in excruciating detail. But what I found really sort of fascinating and actually quite moving as well was this list here, which gives you minute by minute, hour by hour account of how the incident is dealt with, right from the issuing of the warning, the first people arriving on site, I think about 8 minutes, and less than 8, I forget exactly, but in a very handful of minutes, really, people arriving on site, right through to just under 100 hours later, the incident being closed. The various stages from people being alerted, it being reported on, urgent care and first aid, right through to the recovery of people's possessions as well. And I mentioned, didn't I, that there was a different tone, a different spirit perhaps to these raids later in the war, and a huge concern. That had been an issue in the Blitz as well. We shouldn't sort of whitewash that, but it was certainly seen as a much bigger concern as the war went on. There was a big fear around looting, around people stealing from people's from the damaged properties, and as we said earlier at the opening as well, as people's sort of stocks of clothes and furniture, other things as well, become more and more depleted. Kind of every possession counts. So we see accounts of people basically sitting, kind of guarding the wreckage of their houses until it's been officially inventorized, and then therefore they are available. Some form of compensation would be available for the damage to their property, or property would be stored. And so what this gives us a kind of a broader indication of is how the capital responded. So morale suffered badly, but eventually sort of righted itself, and there's no sort of serious belief that morale would have broken and it would have caused sort of a strategic outcome to the war. But people found it hard to bear, and various countermeasures needed to be put in place. So they were kind of the sort of military countermeasures. As the campaign went on, basically as a defence in depth, or sort of a zone defence, was was instigated, whereby the missiles approach was divided into different zones, and some different countermeasures were deployed at each stage. This would include barrage balloons to sort of physically, so the missiles could crash into them, anti-aircraft weapons so they could be shot down, but sort of probably most famously and certainly most sort of valiantly, actual interception by fighter aircraft, Spitfires and Tempests would either shoot them down or most impressively fly wingtip to wingtip to sort of nudge the missiles off course. Obviously, a feat that required a huge amount of skill and bravery. Perhaps one of the defining images of the early Blitz was people sheltering, often in tubes. A funny one that it's seen as an indication of sort of solidarity and success, but in reality, it was of course a reflection that there weren't suitable numbers of appropriate shelters, and so people made do with what they could. Following the Blitz, a number of deep shelters were built but never used. But in July, let me get this right. Yep, in early July, eight of these deep shelters were put back into action. 4 in the north and 4 in the south. And we can see here this is the Clapham shelter. The image on the left isn't contemporary. I'm afraid I didn't put a date there. It's from the 1950s, I think off the top of my head. And the image on the right there is actually again from that Pathé News film, Frontline London. Each of these shelters could hold 8,000 bunks, had a canteen, it had running water, it had a hospital. One of the sources describes them, if you got a ticket for that, you were sort of the aristocrats of sheltering. But actually, many people didn't have time to shelter, or if they did from the V1s, or if they didn't have time to shelter, they had to do so by themselves. I'm sure many of you will know this, but the V1s went by the famous name, the Doodlebugs. That was a name that was a reference to kind of the drone that they made, sometimes compared to the sort of the whirring of a motorbike. The nature of the technology meant that if the engine was running, it was still in flight, and the kind of the dive phase or the attack phase, you might say, was triggered when the engine cut out, either ran out of fuel or through the guidance system. And then the figure that's often bandied around is if you heard the engine cut out, you had 12 seconds to find shelter, to duck under something heavy, effectively. That was what you would do. So what this meant was although people did take sort of shelter for extended periods of time, that idea of sort of sheltering kind of huddled together for comfort was less of a feature of this. And that people talk about the psychological strain of sheltering by yourself, or kind of that constant expectation of some kind of incident happening. Another repeat from the early Blitz was evacuation. This time, far less insensitively named this operation this time. The initial one being Pied Piper. This operation being called Operation Rivulet, which was enacted after a cabinet meeting on the 27th of June. Operation Rivulet saw 1 million people evacuated from the capital. 500,000 people, 500,000 mothers, expectant mothers and children, were billeted with strangers in a way very much the same as in the early Blitz, and another 500,000 were described as aided evacuees. So they made their own arrangements, but they had some assistance with their rail travel and an allowance, things like that. And this exodus of 1 million people from the capital was said to have made the capital much sort of better place to be over that sort of doodlebug summer. There was more food to go around. Those people that did use public shelters found them less crowded. It was generally seen as a success, and some of the lessons had been learned from the earlier evacuation as well. But it was relatively short-lived evacuation. So on the 7th of September, Herbert Morrison, Home Secretary, who we've mentioned before, ended the evacuation. And again, the slight sort of discrepancy, or a bit of a blurring in the various accounts that I've read, but some of the accounts suggest that he'd sort of jumped the gun on this one in terms of sort of overstepping his mandate, you might say, that it was still official government policy that people should be evacuated, but there was a sense that things had been getting better. The countermeasures that we talked about had led to an improvement of things as well, and actually the physical advance of the Allied armies had had pushed at least temporarily, had pushed the capital out of range of some of these these weapons. So on the 7th of September, Herbert Morrison ends evacuation, and then later that same day, the junior minister in charge of the V-bomb problem, one Duncan Sandys, makes one of the, I think, one of the most ill-advised statements I've heard of. I've read in all my years reading history. This is probably one of the most ill-advised. And he says that, except possibly for a few last shots, the Battle of London is over. I'm not a superstitious man, but the one superstition I do have is never to tempt fate, and I'm afraid that is exactly what happened. Because I think I'm right in saying, actually, literally the next day, or certainly within the same few days, the second of the two Vengeance weapons started to fall on London. This is the V2, whereas the V1 was an early example of a cruise missile. This is what we call a ballistic missile. So what this means is, whereas a cruise missile is sort of basically powered till it reaches its target, a ballistic missile flies up into the atmosphere and then kind of comes down under its own speed. It's the same technology that is used happily to launch spaceships, and the same technology that is used to launch nuclear weapons today as well. So this is the first example of this technology being used. So between September 1944 and March 1945, around 1,400 of these missiles were launched against England. Due to their trajectory and speed, they impacted at 3,000 miles an hour, and there was no effective defence against these missiles. The casualty estimate we have for these is 2,754, with many more injured. A very serious and powerful weapon, but one that did come too late in the war to affect sort of serious strategic change and outcome. We talked about the doodle bug and the characteristic noise, and having having 12 seconds to gain shelter. No such opportunity with the V2 rockets, often described, I should say, as long-range rockets in the official literature. And this, yes, I was right. 8th of September, 1944. This is the account that we have of the first V2 rocket falling on the capital, and it's from the Middlesex County Council archive of their wartime records. And it's a kind of handwritten log that goes by day, kind of hour by hour of what happens. And it's the same thing on both sides of the screen. I've just made it bigger so it's a little bit easier to read. So remember, this is someone attending on site with no real prior knowledge of what's happening. It says Brentford. I think that can't quite read that. Incident destruction, thank you, was caused by flying bomb, but this is not definite. Large blast area. Then it goes on. Report no sound apparent. Deep. I'll paraphrase this rather than trying to read the handwriting. Deep blast circles. So here we see two of the kind of the characteristic elements of it. First of all, it was silent. It was silent because it was flying faster than the speed of sound, so you couldn't hear it. It arrived before the sound of it arriving did, which meant you had no warning and there was no defence. So people would be going about their business, and one of these would hit. Also, they had a different kind of pattern of destruction again from the V1s. So the tremendous speed and weight of these projectiles meant that often they would bury themselves into the ground, and sometimes, as in this case, the blast would be kind of contained within the ground, but also they could use. But that being said, there are other instances of which we'll talk about shortly, where they could cause a huge amount of damage. And there is a sense you get in some of the early reports that because the damage of this first one was relatively minor, it was contained simply because of how far it sunk into the ground, that maybe these weapons weren't quite as bad as they feared. But sadly, that was not the case. And before we kind of close with two of those incidents, there's no answer to this. It's one of those questions that's often sort of asked and reported on, but it's an unanswerable question. People different people thought different of these weapons was worse. So some people found the kind of the constant drone of the doodlebugs, always having to be on your guard, ready, was just too much to bear. There's lots of reports of people's kind of nerves being shredded by that, and some of those very same people saying that actually, if it was your day, it was your day with these. A certain fatalism could set in, and that if you didn't have no warning, there was no point worrying. And other people thinking exactly the same things. There are different kind of stories and responses in the literature, as you would expect. So the first of these incidents, I say, is 8th of September, and perhaps lulled people into false sense of security on the amount of damage that they could do. So this text here is from the same file as that report we saw about the bombing in Lewisham here. But it's the same file, but not the same report. It's kept in under the same very similar reference number. And one of the worst of the V2 incidents, and in fact, I think I'm right in saying this is the worst loss of life due to enemy action during the whole Second World War, although more people were killed in the Bethnal Green tube disaster. But so this was certainly the worst of the V2 incidents, was when on the 25th of November at 12:26, one of these hit a Woolworths in London's New Cross. Eyewitness accounts describe a scene of huge carnage afterwards, with bodies being flown in the air, overturned lorries, vehicles burst in flames, and all manner of other catastrophe being on display as well. And this really points, I think, to the random nature of it. The raid was particularly bad on that day, as if I'm not getting this confused with another incident, but my understanding is the raid was particularly bad on that day, because there was a rumour that Woolworths had new frying pans in. It was a shopping day on a Saturday. We've talked about how materials are in short supply, and there was a huge queue outside. There was a huge queue outside, leading to the huge amount of damage being caused. So that was November 1945, and then now we're looking at the last of the V2s to land on London, although not the last to land on the country. And this, gruesomely enough, is described as the second worst of the V2 incidents. So this is 27th of March 1945, and this is Hughes Mansions, Valence Road in Stepney. So although that last incident was in South London, the pattern of the V2s meant that once again the East End of London suffered the most damage from these weapons. And this, as I say, on the penultimate day of the Vengeance campaign, was one of the worst. So it hit at 7:23 in the morning, a building of five floors, so basically a five floor flat, hit by a V2, and I didn't record it. I'm afraid I didn't. I thought I had. Oh no, it's just on the side of the screen. Sorry about that. We can see here 125 people are killed in this. In this raid, so one of the worst of the war. There were two V2s launched on that day. The other fell in Kent slightly after this one, and I'm afraid I had made note of their name, but I can't find it. Yes, and so one of these falls in the morning on Valence, on Hughes Mansions, and a second falls in Orpington in Kent, and that means that 34-year-old Ivy Millerchamp was the last British civilian to die on British soil. Although that was the last of the V2 raids and caused the last sort of fatalities, it wasn't the last raid. We have a record in our records of one more, a V1 this time. You can see supposed cause fly there, 28th of March 1945, and that happily is the last page of the air raid fire report volume that we've been working from this afternoon. The war in Europe had a few more weeks to run before victory was declared on the 8th of May, and forgive me if I get this wrong, the date I have in my head for VJ Day is the 15th of August 1945, and of course instrumental in that in that campaign was the use of nuclear weapons. Those were delivered by aircraft on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but this technology, the V2 technology, would soon be adapted for use for nuclear weapons, and indeed the German engineer behind the V2s, Werner von Braun, after the war, was very quickly taken to the United States and was contributed to the United States rocket program, used for both the development of those intercontinental ballistic missiles and in their space program as well. And on that, I think rather somber note, we'll end the presentation there. Thank you for your attention. It's a strong subject, so thank you for bearing with me as we've talked about it today. As I say, if you have questions, comments, and corrections as well, I'm very open to all of them. What we'll do is we'll start by taking questions from the room, and then we'll move to questions from home as well. And just to make sure, although I have a microphone at the front here that should pick up the room, it doesn't always pick it up 100%. So for the benefit of the people at home, what I'll do is I'll just repeat the question, or if it's a comment, I'll just, forgive me if I summarize it for the benefit of the people at home. So thank you again, and over to you. So are there questions or comments?
There is a plaque to the bomb in Lewisham outside M&S.
Okay. Oh, thank you. So just so everyone heard that. So, and sorry?
Some of the buildings are there today that were there in 1944.
Thank
really changed.
Thank you very much. So some really good local knowledge there. So the Lewisham incident that we talked about, there is a blue plaque there. A plaque. Excuse me. Yes. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. I misspoke there. There's a plaque there which marks the incident, and some of the buildings from that time are surviving as well. And you just said as well that you passed there this morning. So thank you for that. Yes.
There's also a blue plaque on the railway bridge in Grove Road, where the first V1 landed on London.
Thank you. Yes, I think that's probably why I got confused. Actually, yes, that's right. So just so everyone heard, there's a blue plaque. It is a blue plaque this time. Thank you, on the Grove Road railway bridge from the first V1 on 13th of June. Thank you.
Just a question for me to Clark, or get straight in my head.
Yeah.
Said, did you say that 142 B2s landed in Croydon?
Almost. So the question was just a clarification on the weapons that fell on Croydon. So 142, yes, but V1s, not V2s. So the cruise missiles, not the V2s. Yeah. Thank you. You're welcome. Are there any questions from home? Sorry.
There's just one question.
Yep.
It sounds like the navigation targeting of the V1 rockets were influenced by reports of double agents. Was the navigation of the V2 rockets influenced at all?
Okay, so the question was, to sort of summarise it, was the V2 targeting, so the ballistic missiles, influenced by double agents? I don't know, is the honest answer. I don't know. I don't know to what extent they were targeted. I don't know if that's quite how it worked. So honestly, I don't know. I'm just going to say that I don't know. I'll always say if I don't know, and that's one of those occasions. Thankfully, I'm in a very good place to find it out, so I might try and find it out for myself. But if I don't know and I can't make an educated guess, I'll just say. So thank you. It's a really, really important question. You stopped me. Yes, the question in the back there.
I understand that a lot of these devices were made in slave labour conditions. I've also heard that the prisoners would try and sabotage the weapons. So basically, I guess I'm wondering how effective at all that sabotage was.
Yeah, thank you. So the question was, firstly, that the V1 and the V2s were made under sort of slave labour conditions. That's absolutely right. There are really, really horrible, sort of shocking images that you can find there. One of the more kind of gruesome things. I think with the V2s, I believe more people were killed making them than were killed in action. Not that that makes it any better, I don't know, but there is something in that statistic. I don't know quite what it means, but it seems important to mention that. And yes, I've heard the same thing about the sabotage as well. So their comment was with sabotage, and I don't know to what extent. So the weapons weren't hugely reliable. We talked, didn't we, about the kind of the amount that didn't make their target. And no doubt some of that was due to the sabotage. I don't know what ratio of parts that were sabotaged versus just the inherent sort of fragility of the technology. I don't know, but I've heard exactly that same thing. Yeah, thank you. And if you're interested in finding a little bit more about that, actually the Imperial War Museum have some really quite good and well-made accessible documentaries about that, which is a useful resource. Thank you. Are there other sort of questions or comments about from the room or at home?
So one more from online. The question was, what were the two main targets, Woolworths and something else?
Oh, in the V2 raid. So neither were targeted. It was just sort of bad luck that it fell there. But just digging through the memory banks. So the most of the incidents was at Woolworths, but there was a bus as well. That's right. So Woolworths and a bus. Thank you for that. Yeah, was hit at the same time. And it's really quite heartbreaking. There was apparently a long-standing rivalry between the Woolworths and the John Lewis nearby, but then the people from John Lewis were some of the first to assist afterwards. It's strong stuff. Are there any other questions? Home, Zoe? Or in the room? No. Well, thank you. Thank you again. As I say, it's quite a strong and heavy topic, but I think it's an important one as well. If you're joining us from home, have a look on our Eventbrite. There are various other events coming up linked to the World War, the London Second World War exhibition. I'll be talking about Cross and Tibbs, photographers on the front line, shortly. They're another really important collection we have here that documents these events. We also have a guest speaker talking about some air raids of the First World War coming up in June as well. If you can find information about that at Eventbrite. If you're here in person today, do grab one of our events brochures. And I would be remiss of me not to flag up that a week tomorrow, so that'll be the 21st of March, if I'm not mistaken. So a week on 22nd, excuse me, on the Friday. I'm just going to get that right. I'm going to check. And let me get that right. It's important to get it right. So on the, bear with me for this. Sorry, just to make sure I get it right. It'll be really annoying. Oh, it's in the other events guide. We'll go with a week tomorrow. I will be getting out some of the alongside some of these talks. I'd run a kind of a complimentary event called Archives in Focus, and basically it will be an opportunity for you to look at the first hand most of the things that I've got out today. So if that's of interest to you, please do come along. You can book on via Eventbrite where you booked here. And yes, just before for me to say thank you again for coming along. It's a good thing to do. So thank you very much. And we can stop there.
Very interesting, Tom. Thank you. And I'll see you Friday next week.
Looking forward to it. Yeah.